The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Riverside County Superior Court as 7-year-old Lily Martinez stepped out of her mother's beaten Honda Civic. Her tiny fingers clutched a worn teddy bear named Mr. Buttons, whose left eye had been missing for over a year. The stuffing was coming out of his arm, where she had squeezed him too tightly during countless sleepless nights. Today, this threadbare companion was her only source of comfort as she faced the most terrifying day of her young life. Carmen Martinez. Lily's mother walked beside her daughter with hollow eyes that had lost their spark months ago. Her hands shook as she smoothed down Lily's best dress, a pale yellow sundress with tiny flowers that her grandmother had bought for Easter too, years prior. It was too small now, the hem hitting above Lily's knees, but it was the only nice dress the family could afford. Carmen's own appearance told the story of a woman torn apart by an impossible choice: believe her daughter's accusations against the man she loved, or protect the only stable income their family had ever known. Detective Raymond Torres emerged from a black SUV in the courthouse parking lot, flanked by 2 fellow officers who had volunteered to provide moral support. At 42, Torres commanded respect wherever he went. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his badge gleaming, his reputation spotless. For 8 years, he had served the community with distinction, earning commendations for bravery and several awards for his work with at-risk youth. The irony wasn't lost on anyone following the case. Torres caught sight of Lily across the parking lot and offered what appeared to be a reassuring smile, though his eyes remained cold as winter. Steel. He had perfected this expression over the months since the accusations began, the look of a wounded protector, a man falsely accused by a disturbed child seeking attention. To most observers, he appeared to be the victim of a terrible misunderstanding. Inside the courthouse, the hallways buzzed with nervous energy. Reporters had caught wind of the case, a decorated police officer accused by his 7-year-old stepdaughter, and they lined the corridors like vultures waiting for carrion. Their cameras flashed as Lily and her mother hurried past, the little girl burying her face deeper into Mr. Button's matted fur. "Mrs. Martinez, Mrs. Martinez," called out Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. "How do you feel about your daughter testifying against Detective Torres today?" Carmen didn't respond, her protective arm pulling Lily closer as they pushed through the crowd toward the courtroom doors. Prosecutor Diana Webb waited in the victim services room, reviewing her notes one final time. At 38, she had handled dozens of child abuse cases, but this one was different. The accused wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows, or even a typical family member. Torres was a pillar of the community, beloved by colleagues and trusted by citizens. Webb knew that the jury would want to believe him, not the small, frightened child whose testimony was their only real evidence. "How is she doing?" Webb asked gently as Carmen and Lily entered the small conference room. Social worker Patricia Gomez, who had been working with Lily for months, shook her head slightly. "She hasn't spoken much this morning. Last night she had the nightmare again, the one where he comes to her room, wearing his badge and gun." Gomez's voice carried the weight of too many similar cases, too many children whose innocence had been stolen by those they should have been able to trust most. Lily sat in a child-sized chair, her legs swinging freely as they didn't quite reach the floor. Her dark eyes, which should have sparkled with the joy of childhood, instead held the depth of knowledge that no 7-year-old should possess. She understood things that her classmates couldn't even imagine, the weight of secrets, the crushing burden of speaking truth when everyone around you wants to believe lies, the terrible loneliness of being a child trapped in an adult's nightmare. "Lily, sweetheart," Webb knelt down to the child's eye level. "Remember what we practiced? You just have to tell the truth about what happened. That's all. Can you do that for me?" Lily nodded almost imperceptibly, though her grip on Mr. Buttons tightened. As they prepared to enter the courtroom, none of them noticed the special preparation that had been made at the prosecution's request. Officer Jake Reynolds, a 15-year veteran of the force, stood in the hallway with his partner, not the humankind, but a 3-year-old German shepherd named Rex. This wasn't Rex's first time in a courtroom. He had been specially trained as a therapy dog for traumatic cases, his gentle nature and calm demeanor providing comfort to witnesses who needed it most. Rex wore a special vest identifying him as a certified courthouse therapy animal, a relatively new program that had shown remarkable success in helping child witnesses find the courage to testify. His training had been extensive, learning to remain perfectly still for hours, to provide comfort without being distracting, and most importantly, to sense when someone was in emotional distress. The courtroom itself was intimidating enough for adults, let alone a small child. Dark wood paneling reached to the high ceiling, and the judge's bench loomed like a throne above the proceedings. The gallery was packed with reporters, curious citizens, and off-duty police officers who had come to support their colleague. Their whispered conversations created a low hum that felt oppressive to anyone entering the space. Judge Patricia Stone, a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair and kind but firm eyes, had requested this case specifically. She had a reputation for being particularly sensitive to cases involving children, though she never let that sensitivity compromise her commitment to justice. She understood the unique challenges this case would present, and had already made several unusual accommodations, including allowing the therapy dog, a decision that had required extensive legal research and consultation with child psychologists. As Lily entered the courtroom, her small hand firmly grasping her mother's, the weight of dozens of eyes fell upon her. The courtroom fell silent, as if everyone understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just another case. It was a test of the justice system itself. Could a child's voice be heard above the noise of adult politics, professional reputations, and societal expectations? And then Lily saw him. Rex sat calmly beside Officer Reynolds near the prosecutor's table, his intelligent brown eyes immediately finding hers across the room. For the first time in months, something in Lily's expression shifted. It wasn't hope exactly, but it wasn't despair either. It was recognition, the understanding that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in this fight. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Stone took her place at the bench, unaware that the next few hours would change not only the life of one small girl, but the way the entire legal system approached cases involving child witnesses. As Lily was sworn in, her small voice barely audible as she promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, Rex remained perfectly still, his presence a silent promise that courage sometimes comes on 4 legs and with a gentle heart. The witness stand seemed enormous as Lily Martinez settled into the brown leather chair, her feet dangling several inches above the footrest designed for adult witnesses. Court clerk Maria Santos had quickly retrieved a phone book to boost the 7-year-old higher, but even with the makeshift booster, Lily looked impossibly small against the imposing backdrop of the courtroom. Her warm teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, sat in her lap like a fuzzy shield against the sea of adult faces staring at her with varying degrees of skepticism, curiosity, and pity. Prosecutor Diana Webb approached the witness stand with deliberate slowness, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. She had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, knowing that the next hour would likely determine whether justice would be served or whether a predator would walk free to harm other children. Webb's own daughter was 8, just 1 year older than Lily, and every time she looked at the frightened child before her, she saw her own little girl's face. "Good morning, Lily," Webb began, her voice gentle, but clear enough for the court reporter to capture every word. Can you tell us your full name and how old you are? Lily's response was barely above a whisper. Lily Marie Martinez. I'm 7. Her dark eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, landing briefly on Detective Torres before quickly looking away. Even from across the room, she could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. Lily, do you know why you're here today? Webb continued, maintaining her patient tone despite the pressure she felt from Judge Stone's schedule and the restless jury. To tell about about what Raymond did to me. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Torres's defense attorney, Marcus Kane, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit, made a note on his yellow legal pad with sharp, aggressive strokes. Webb nodded encouragingly. Lily, can you tell us how you know Detective Torres? He's my mom's husband. He married her when I was 5. Lily's voice grew slightly stronger as she talked about something concrete and non-threatening. He moved into our house on Maple Street, the blue one with the broken fence. And how did things change after Detective Torres moved in with you and your mother? This question prompted an immediate objection from Kane. Your Honor, leading the witness. The prosecutor is implying that something changed, which assumes facts not in evidence. Judge Stone considered for a moment. Sustained. Ms. Webb, please rephrase. Lily, can you tell us what life was like after Detective Torres came to live with you? Lily's grip on Mr. Buttons tightened visibly. At first, it was okay. He bought me ice cream and took us to the zoo. Mom was happy. She smiled more. Her voice caught slightly. But then things got scary. Can you tell us about the scary things, Lily? The courtroom fell into complete silence. Even the court reporter seemed to hold her breath as Lily struggled to find words for experiences that no child should ever have to articulate. Rex, the German Shepherd therapy dog, seemed to sense the shift in energy from across the room. His ears perked up, and he fixed his gentle brown eyes on the small witness. He would come to my room after Mom went to sleep, Lily began, her voice becoming smaller with each word. He said it was our special game, but it didn't feel like a game. It hurt, and he said ... She stopped, swallowing hard. Take your time, sweetheart, Webb encouraged softly. He said that nobody arrests policemen. That his badge meant he could do whatever he wanted, and if I told anyone, they wouldn't believe me because everybody loves police officers. Lily's words came out in a rush, as if she needed to expel them before they poisoned her from within. The impact on the courtroom was immediate and devastating. Several spectators gasped audibly. One woman in the gallery, a retired teacher who had known Torres through community events, put her hand over her mouth in shock. 2 jurors, both mothers, exchanged horrified glances. Torres himself maintained his composure with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to controlling his expressions under pressure. He leaned over to whisper something to his attorney, his face a mask of wounded innocence. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a man falsely accused, struggling to understand how his stepdaughter could make such terrible allegations. Kane was on his feet instantly. Objection, Your Honor. This testimony is highly prejudicial and based on the unreliable memory of a 7-year-old child. The prosecution has provided no corroborating evidence for these inflammatory accusations. Before Judge Stone could rule, Webb interjected smoothly, Your Honor, we have substantial corroborating evidence that we'll be presenting throughout this trial, including medical records, behavioral reports from Lily's school, and physical evidence recovered from the defendant's personal effects. The mention of physical evidence caused a visible reaction from Torres, the first crack in his carefully maintained facade. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Webb caught it. She had been watching him carefully throughout Lily's testimony, looking for any tell that might reveal his guilt. Overruled, Judge Stone declared. The witness may continue. As Lily resumed her testimony, describing incidents that grew progressively more disturbing, the atmosphere in the courtroom became increasingly tense. She spoke of being threatened with his service weapon, of him showing her crime scene photos to frighten her into silence, of him using his police radio to monitor her mother's whereabouts so he would know when they were alone. He said he had friends at all the schools and hospitals, Lily continued, her voice becoming more confident as she found her rhythm. He said if I ever told anyone, his police friends would take me away from Mom forever, and I'd go to a place where bad kids live. Dr. Jennifer Coleman, a child psychologist sitting in the gallery as an expert observer, took detailed notes. She had interviewed hundreds of abused children throughout her career, and everything about Lily's testimony, the specific details, the emotional consistency, the reluctant disclosure, matched the patterns she had observed in genuine cases of abuse. Meanwhile, Torres's support network in the gallery began to show signs of doubt. Officer Michael Rodriguez, Torres's longtime partner, found himself studying his colleague's face with new eyes. There had been incidents over the years, times when Torres had volunteered for cases involving children, requests for home visits that seemed unnecessary, comments about certain victims that had made Rodriguez uncomfortable. At the time, he had dismissed these red flags as quirks of personality. Now, he wondered if he had been willfully blind to signs that should have been obvious. The most damaging part of Lily's testimony came when Webb asked about specific dates and times. Lily's recall was remarkably precise for a child her age. She remembered that the first incident occurred on a Tuesday night when her mother was working a double shift at the diner because she had been excited about watching her favorite cartoon the next morning, but was too upset to enjoy it. She remembered that another incident happened the night before, Halloween, because she had been looking forward to trick-or-treating, but instead spent the evening crying in her closet. Kane frantically scribbled notes, already planning his cross-examination. Strategy. He would argue that the child had been coached, that her memories were contaminated by adult influence, that her timeline was impossible to verify. But as he listened to the specificity of her recollections and watched the jury's increasingly sympathetic expressions, he realized that his usual tactics might not be enough. As Lily's direct testimony continued, painting an increasingly detailed picture of systematic abuse and manipulation, the courtroom had transformed from a place of legal procedure into a theater of human tragedy. The weight of her words seemed to press down on everyone present, creating an atmosphere so thick with tension that it felt difficult to breathe. And through it all, Rex remained alert and focused on the small witness, as if he understood that his most important work was yet to come. The courtroom clock ticked toward 11:30 a.m. when everything began to unravel. Prosecutor Diana Webb had just asked Lily to describe the most recent incident, one that had occurred only 6 weeks earlier, on a rainy Thursday night when Carmen had been called in for an emergency shift at the hospital where she worked as a cleaning lady. The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and everyone in the courtroom seemed to sense that they were approaching a critical moment. Lily's small hands, which had been nervously stroking Mr. Button's matted fur throughout her testimony, suddenly went completely still. Her dark eyes, which moments before had been focused on Webb's encouraging face, now stared blankly at something beyond the courtroom walls. The change was so sudden and dramatic that it sent a chill through everyone present. "Lily?" Webb prompted gently, stepping closer to the witness stand. "Can you tell us what happened that Thursday night?" But Lily didn't respond. She couldn't respond. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, each breath coming in quick, desperate gasps that made her small chest rise and fall like a trapped bird. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and ghostly against the dark wood of the witness chair. Dr. Jennifer Coleman, the child psychologist observing from the gallery, immediately recognized the signs. This wasn't simple nervousness or fear. This was a full-blown panic attack, the kind she had seen in combat veterans and severe trauma survivors. The child's nervous system had reached its breaking point and was shutting down to protect itself from further psychological damage. I can't, Lily whispered, but the words came out as barely audible squeaks. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably and missed her. Buttons fell from her lap onto the floor of the witness stand with a soft thud that somehow seemed to echo through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. Defense attorney Marcus Kane saw his opportunity and seized it immediately. He rose from his chair with the speed of a predator sensing wounded prey. Your Honor, I move for an immediate mistrial. This witness is clearly unable to continue her testimony, and any further questioning would constitute psychological abuse of a minor. Judge Patricia Stone held up her hand to silence Kane while keeping her eyes fixed on Lily. The experienced judge had seen many difficult moments in her courtroom over the years, but watching a 7-year-old child disintegrate before her eyes was testing even her considerable composure. Ms. Webb, I think we need to... No. A word erupted from Lily with shocking force, startling everyone in the courtroom. But it wasn't defiance. It was pure terror. Her eyes had found Detective Torres across the room, and what she saw there made her panic spike to even more dangerous levels. Torres was looking directly at her with an expression that would have appeared concerned to casual observers, but Lily recognized it immediately. It was the same look he had given her countless times before, the look that said he was in control, that he could reach her anywhere, anytime, and that no one would be able to protect her from his revenge. He's looking at me, Lily gasped, her voice rising toward hysteria. He's looking at me like he does when... She couldn't finish the sentence. Her entire body was now trembling violently, and she had begun rocking back and forth in the witness chair in a desperate attempt to self-soothe. Bailiff Tom Morrison, a 30-year veteran of courthouse security, had moved closer to the witness stand, unsure of what to do. He had handled disruptions, outbursts, and even physical altercations, but a traumatized child having a psychological breakdown was completely outside his area of expertise. Carmen Martinez, Lily's mother, sat frozen in the gallery. Part of her wanted to run to her daughter, to scoop her up and carry her away from this nightmare. But another part of her, the part that had been slowly accepting the truth about the man she had married, understood that stopping now would mean Torres would win. Her daughter would have endured this trauma for nothing. Webb tried again, her own voice now showing signs of straying. Lily, you're safe here. Detective Torres can't hurt you in this courtroom. There are lots of people here to protect you. But Lily was beyond hearing rational reassurances. The trauma of reliving her experiences, combined with the overwhelming stress of being the center of attention in a room full of adults, had triggered a complete psychological shutdown. She was no longer present in the courtroom. Her mind had retreated to whatever safe space it could find, leaving her body to cope with the overwhelming terror on its own. I want to go home, she whispered, though her voice was so quiet that only the court reporter, straining to catch every word, could hear her. I want to go home. I want to go home. The phrase became a mantra, repeated over and over as she continued to rock in the chair. Kane pressed his advantage ruthlessly. Your Honor, this child is clearly suffering severe psychological distress. Continuing this testimony would be tantamount to torture. I respectfully request that you declare this witness incompetent to testify and dismiss all charges against my client. The words hit Webb like physical blows. She knew Kane was right. About one thing, they couldn't continue with Lily in this condition. But she also knew that if they stopped now, if they allowed this breakdown to end the trial, Torres would walk free. And there would be other children, other victims who would suffer because the system had failed to protect them. Judge Stone found herself facing one of the most difficult decisions of her judicial career. Every instinct told her to protect the child, to end this ordeal and get Lily the help she obviously needed. But she also understood the broader implications. If they couldn't find a way to help this child tell her story, how many other children would suffer in silence? The courtroom had become completely silent, except for Lily's whispered pleas to go home, and the soft sound of her rocking against the leather chair. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keys as she waited to see what would happen next. Torres himself seemed to understand that this moment could determine his fate. He leaned back in his chair with what appeared to be relief, already anticipating his victory. In his mind, he had won. The child had broken, just as he had always known she would if pushed too far. His reputation would be restored, his freedom secured, and he would be free to continue his predatory behavior with other vulnerable children. But Torres had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated the power of compassion and the extraordinary bond that can exist between a traumatized child and a therapy animal who understands suffering. Across the courtroom, Rex, the German Shepherd, had been watching Lily's distress with increasing agitation. His training had taught him to remain still and quiet during proceedings, but every instinct in his body was telling him that this child needed help immediately. His ears were forward, his body tense with the desire to act. Officer Jake Reynolds, Rex's handler, could feel his partner's tension through the leash and found himself fighting his own instincts to intervene. As Lily's breakdown continued to intensify, as the lawyers argued and the judge wrestled with her decision, as Torres sat smugly anticipating his freedom, Rex made a decision that would change everything. The gentle therapy dog, who had been trained to provide comfort to traumatized children, understood something that all the adults in the room had missed. Sometimes the most important rules are the ones that need to be broken. The breaking point had arrived, but it wouldn't be Lily's spirit that shattered. It would be the barriers that had kept help just out of reach. Officer Jake Reynolds felt the tension in Rex's body before he saw the decision in his partner's eyes. The German Shepherd had been trained for 3 years to remain perfectly still during courtroom proceedings, to provide comfort through presence. Alone, never to approach a witness without explicit permission. But as Lily's panic attack intensified and her desperate whispers of "I want to go home" filled the silent courtroom, Rex's training warred with something deeper, an instinct that transcended human rules and regulations. Reynolds had been Rex's handler since the dog was barely a year old. He had watched his 4-legged partner comfort dozens of traumatized children, veterans suffering from PTSD, and victims of violent crimes. Rex had an uncanny ability to sense when someone needed help, often alerting Reynolds to emotional distress before the humans in the room had even noticed. But Reynolds had never seen his partner this agitated during a court proceeding. The 60-pound German Shepherd's muscles coiled beneath his thick coat as he watched Lily rock back and forth in the witness chair. His dark eyes tracked every movement, every shuddering breath, every tear that rolled down her pale cheeks. When Mr. Buttons had fallen to the floor, Rex had actually taken a half-step forward before Reynolds's gentle pressure on the leash reminded him of his boundaries. Judge Patricia Stone was in the middle of addressing defense attorney Kane's motion for mistrial when Rex made his move. With the fluid grace of his breed, he slipped his head out of his collar, a trick he had learned as a puppy but had never used during his professional career. Reynolds felt the leash go slack in his hands and looked down in shock to see his partner padding silently across the marble floor toward the witness stand. "Rex, no," Reynolds whispered urgently, but the dog didn't even glance back. Every eye in the courtroom followed the therapy dog's progress as he approached. Lily, with the careful deliberation of a creature who understood the gravity of the moment. Kane immediately seized on this new development. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The prosecution's therapy animal is approaching the witness without permission, which could be seen as an attempt to coach or influence her testimony." But Judge Stone held up her hand for silence, her experienced eyes taking in the scene before her. She had been a judge for over 20 years, and she had learned to trust her instincts about when to follow protocol and when to let humanity override. Rigid procedure. What she saw was not an attempt at manipulation, but a living creature responding to suffering with the pure compassion that they sometimes escaped human beings caught up in legal technicalities. Rex reached the witness stand and sat down directly in front of Lily's chair, close enough that she could reach out and touch him if she chose to, but not so close as to invade her personal space. His positioning was perfect. He had placed himself between Lily and Detective Torres, effectively blocking her view of the man whose presence had triggered her breakdown. The effect was almost immediate. Lily's frantic rocking slowed slightly, and her rapid breathing began to even out. She was still in the grip of panic, but something about Rex's calm presence had penetrated the wall of terror that had enclosed her. Her eyes, which had been darting frantically around the courtroom, focused on the dog's gentle brown gaze. Dr. Jennifer Coleman watched from the gallery with professional fascination. She had read studies about the therapeutic benefits of animal-assisted therapy, but seeing it in action was remarkable. The child's autonomic nervous system was already beginning to regulate in response to Rex's presence. The dog wasn't doing anything extraordinary. He was simply being present, calm, and available. Yet his impact was more powerful than any medication or therapeutic intervention could have been in that moment. Reynolds approached the bench. Slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of non-threat. "Your Honor, I apologize for my partner's breach of protocol. Rex has never done anything like this before. I can remove him immediately if you prefer." Judge Stone looked from Reynolds to Rex to Lily, who was now staring at the therapy dog with something approaching wonder. The little girl's breathing was still labored, but the violent trembling had subsided. More importantly, she was present again. Her consciousness had returned from whatever dark place it had retreated to during the panic attack. "Officer Reynolds," Judge Stone said carefully, "is your partner trained to work with traumatized children?" "Yes, Your Honor. Rex has over 3 years of specialized training in trauma response and victim support. He's worked with dozens of child witnesses and has never had a single incident of inappropriate behavior." Prosecutor Webb saw an opportunity and stepped forward. "Your Honor, given the witness's obvious distress and the therapeutic animal's calming effect, I request permission to continue the examination with Rex present to provide emotional support." Kane was on his feet again, his face red with indignation. "This is completely improper. The prosecution is essentially bringing in an unauthorized emotional support animal to manipulate the witness's state of mind. This violates every principle of fair trial procedure." But as Kane spoke, something interesting happened. Rex turned his head to look at the defense attorney, not with aggression or warning, but with what could only be described as assessment. The dog seemed to be taking the measure of this man who was arguing against helping a frightened child, and his expression suggested he found Kane wanting. Several jury members noticed this exchange, and their faces showed what they thought of a lawyer who would argue against anything that might help a traumatized 7-year-old feel safe enough to testify. Judge Stone found herself in uncharted legal territory. There was no precedent for this situation in her experience, no clear protocol to follow. But as she looked at Lily, who was now tentatively reaching one small hand toward Rex's head, she realized that sometimes justice required flexibility and compassion rather than rigid adherence to procedure. "Mr. Kane," she said firmly, "your objection is noted for the record. However, I am going to allow the therapy dog to remain with the witness. Officer Reynolds, please approach the bench. As Reynolds walked forward, Rex remained perfectly still, his attention focused entirely on Lily. The little girl's fingers had made contact with his soft fur, and she was running her hand gently over his head. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she looked like what she was, a 7-year-old child, rather than a broken victim, carrying the weight of impossible secrets. Officer Reynolds, Judge Stone said quietly, I need your assurance that your partner will not interfere with the proceedings or influence the witness's testimony in any way. You have my word, Your Honor. Rex is trained to provide comfort and emotional support only. He won't coach or lead the witness in any way. Judge Stone nodded and returned to her seat. The court will allow the therapy dog to remain with the witness. Ms. Webb, you may continue your examination. As Webb approached the witness stand once again, she saw something that filled her with cautious hope. Lily was still pale and clearly shaken, but she was present and alert. Her hand rested on Rex's head like an anchor, grounding her in the moment rather than allowing her to drift back into the dark memories that had overwhelmed her. Lily, Webb said gently, are you feeling better now? For the first time in what felt like hours, Lily spoke clearly. He's soft and warm, and he's not scared. Rex seemed to understand that he had been given an enormous responsibility. This wasn't just about providing comfort to one frightened child. His presence in this courtroom could determine whether justice would be served or whether a predator would walk free to harm other children. The unlikely hero had taken his position, and the real battle for truth was about to begin. With Rex's calming presence anchoring her to the present moment, Lily began to find fragments of her voice again. Prosecutor Diana Webb approached the witness stand with renewed hope, though she kept her movements slow and deliberate, afraid that any sudden gesture might shatter the fragile peace that the therapy dog had helped establish. Lily, Webb said softly, can you tell us about the last time Detective Torres came to your room? Lily's hand moved rhythmically through Rex's thick fur, the repetitive motion seeming to give her strength. It was ... It was after Mom got called to work. She had to go help at the hospital because someone got really sick. Her voice was quiet but steady, a remarkable transformation from the panicked whispers of just minutes before. What day was that, sweetheart? Thursday, 6 weeks ago. I remember because the next day was Friday, and Fridays are pizza day at school, but Lily's voice caught, and she looked down at Rex, who gazed back at her with infinite patience. I couldn't eat the pizza because my tummy hurt too much. Detective Torres shifted in his seat for the first time since Rex had approached the witness stand. The therapy dog's ears immediately swiveled toward the sound, though he didn't turn his head away from Lily. Officer Reynolds, watching his partner carefully, noticed the subtle change in Rex's body language, a slight tensing that suggested heightened alertness. Webb continued her questioning with careful precision. Can you tell us what happened that Thursday night after your mother left for work? Lily's breathing began to quicken again, but this time she seemed to catch herself before the panic could take hold. She leaned forward slightly, bringing her face closer to Rex's, and whispered something so quietly that even Webb, standing just a few feet away, couldn't make out the words. But Officer Reynolds could hear her, standing alert beside the witness. Stand, his trained ear caught the two words that Lily whispered directly into Rex's ear. Help me. The impact on Reynolds was immediate and profound. His 15 years of police work had taught him to recognize significant moments, and every instinct told him that what he had just heard was crucial. But it wasn't just the words themselves. It was the way Lily had said them, with a heartbreaking combination of hope and desperation that suggested she was remembering something important. Reynolds caught Webb's eye and raised his hand slightly, a signal that something significant had occurred. Webb, trusting the experienced officer's judgment, approached the bench with a request for a brief sidebar. Defense Attorney Kane immediately objected. Your Honor, the prosecution cannot confer with the police officer during the witness's testimony. This appears to be an attempt to coordinate their strategy based on something the officer may have overheard. Judge Stone considered this carefully. The situation was unprecedented, and she was acutely aware that any decision she made could affect not only this case, but establish precedent for future trials involving therapy animals and child witnesses. Officer Reynolds, Judge Stone said, did the witness say something to your therapy dog that you believe is relevant to this case? Reynolds nodded gravely. Yes, Your Honor. The witness whispered 2 words that I believe may be significant to understanding her testimony. Kane was on his feet again, his frustration evident. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The officer is not a witness in this case, and any communication between the child and the therapy animal should be considered privileged therapeutic interaction, not evidence. But Webb had already grasped the significance of what Reynolds had heard. Your Honor, I believe Officer Reynolds may have heard something that could provide crucial context for the witness's testimony. I request permission to question him briefly about what he observed. Judge Stone found herself once again navigating uncharted legal territory. The intersection of therapy animal protocols, child witness protection, and criminal procedure was complex, but she was beginning to understand that this case might require innovative solutions to serve the interests of justice. I'm going to allow Officer Reynolds to share what he heard, Judge Stone decided. Mr. Kane, your objections are noted for the record, but the court's primary concern is ensuring that we hear all relevant testimony while protecting the welfare of this child witness. Reynolds stepped forward, his professional demeanor unchanged, despite the unprecedented nature of his testimony. Your Honor, the witness leaned forward and whispered 2 words into Rex's ear. Help me. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of confusion and speculation. What could possibly be significant about those 2 words? Children asked for help all the time, especially when they were frightened or overwhelmed. But Webb understood immediately. She had spent months preparing this case, reviewing every detail of how Lily's abuse had first come to light. Those 2 words weren't just a plea for assistance in the courtroom. They were the key to a crucial piece of evidence that had been puzzling investigators for months. Officer Reynolds, Webb continued, in your experience working with traumatized children, is it common for them to repeat significant phrases or words when they are in stressful situations? Yes, it is. Children often return to words or phrases that were important during traumatic events, especially when they're trying to process difficult memories. Kane realized that something significant was happening, though he couldn't yet understand what. Objection, Your Honor. Officer Reynolds is not a licensed psychologist, and his speculation about the witness's psychological state is not admissible. Sustained, Judge Stone ruled. Officer Reynolds, please limit your testimony to your direct observations. But the damage to the defense's case was already being done. Dr. Jennifer Coleman, watching from the gallery, had immediately grasped the significance of Lily's whispered words. As a child psychologist, she knew that trauma victims often repeated key phrases from their experiences, especially phrases that had represented hope or the possibility of rescue. Webb returned to Lily, who was still gently stroking Rex's fur. The little girl seemed calmer now, as if the act of whispering to the therapy dog had somehow released pressure that had been building inside her. Lily, when you whispered to Rex just now, were you remembering something important? Lily nodded slowly. I remembered the first time I said those words. The first time I asked for help. Can you tell us about that time? Lily looked around the courtroom, her eyes finally settling on her mother in the gallery. Carmen Martinez sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, as she began to understand what her daughter was about to reveal. "It was to Rusty," Lily said. "Simply, Mrs. Patterson's dog next door. I was in her backyard, and I was crying, and Rusty came over to me. I whispered 'help me' to him, because I didn't know how to tell a person. Dogs are safe. Dogs don't judge you or call you a liar." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson, Eleanor Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had been on the prosecution's witness list, but whose testimony had seemed peripheral to the case. Webb suddenly realized that they had been approaching this witness completely wrong. Rex seemed to understand the importance of the moment. He remained perfectly still, providing a stable presence for Lily as she continued her testimony. But his eyes had found Detective Torres across the courtroom, and for the first time since entering the court, the gentle therapy dog's expression held something that looked remarkably like judgment. Those two words, "help me," had just blown the prosecution's case wide open, and everyone in the courtroom was beginning to understand that what they thought they knew about this case was only the beginning of a much larger and more compelling truth. The mention of Mrs. Patterson's dog Rusty sent an electric shock through Prosecutor Diana Webb's mind. She suddenly remembered the elderly neighbor's initial police report from 18 months ago, a rambling, seemingly confused account that investigators had largely dismissed as the observations of a lonely widow who spent too much time watching her neighbors. But now, with Lily's revelation about confiding in Rusty, Webb realized they had completely misunderstood the significance of Eleanor Patterson's testimony. Judge Patricia Stone called for a 30-minute recess, and Webb immediately huddled. With her team in the small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, Detective Maria Santos, the lead investigator on the case, pulled out a thick file folder that contained all the original witness statements. "Here it is," Santos said, spreading the papers across the conference table. "Eleanor Patterson, age 73, widow, lives at 847 Maple Street, right next door to the Martinez family. Look at this statement she gave 18 months ago." Webb read aloud from the yellowed police report. "I found the little Martinez girl in my backyard around 10 p.m. on October 15th. She was crying and talking to my dog Rusty. At first I thought she was just playing, but then I heard her say things that didn't sound right for a child to know. She was using words about ... things. When I asked her what was wrong, she got scared and ran home. The next day, I called the police because something felt very wrong. We dismissed this as hearsay," Santos admitted, shaking her head. Patterson couldn't repeat exactly what Lily had said to the dog, and without specifics, we thought it was just an elderly woman's imagination. We had no idea that Lily was actually making her first disclosure that night. Webb's mind raced as she connected the dots. So Lily told Rusty about the abuse. Mrs. Patterson overheard enough to be concerned, and she called in the tip that started our investigation. But we never made the connection, because Lily was too terrified to tell us the truth when we first interviewed her. Back in the courtroom, defense attorney Marcus Kane was having his own urgent conference with Detective Torres. For the first time since the trial began, Torres looked genuinely shaken. The confident demeanor he had maintained throughout Lily's testimony was cracking, and Kane could see the fear starting to show in his client's eyes. "They can't prove anything with this dog story," Torres whispered urgently. "It's still just the word of a traumatized child against a decorated police officer. Patterson's an old woman with dementia. Half the neighborhood thinks she's losing her mind." But Kane wasn't as confident as he tried to sound. He had built his defense strategy around the assumption that Lily's disclosure had been coached by adults with ulterior motives. If the child had actually first revealed the abuse to a dog in a neighbor's backyard, and if that neighbor had been the anonymous tipster who started the investigation, it completely undermined his theory of adult manipulation. When caught, Reconvened, Webb stood with renewed purpose. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to recall a witness who was previously scheduled to testify later in the trial. We request permission to call Mrs. Eleanor Patterson to the stand immediately. Kane objected vigorously. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The prosecution cannot simply rearrange their witness order in the middle of trial based on new revelations. Mrs. Patterson was scheduled for tomorrow, and the defense has prepared our cross-examination accordingly. Judge Stone considered the request carefully. Ms. Webb, can you explain the urgency of calling this witness out of order? Your Honor, Mrs. Patterson's testimony is directly relevant to the witness's statement about how she first disclosed the abuse. This information provides crucial context that could affect the entire understanding of this case. I'll allow it, Judge Stone decided. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Patterson to the witness stand. Eleanor Patterson entered the courtroom with the slow, careful steps of someone who had lived 73 years and had seen more than her share of human suffering. She was a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing her best navy blue dress and clutching a worn leather purse. Her eyes immediately found Lily at the witness stand, and her expression softened with grandmotherly concern. As Mrs. Patterson was sworn in, Rex remained alert at Lily's side. The therapy dog seemed to sense that something important was about to happen, and his protective positioning near the child became even more pronounced. Webb approached the elderly witness with respect and gentleness. Mrs. Patterson, do you know the witness, Lily Martinez? Oh, yes, dear. She's my next-door neighbor. Such a sweet little girl. But Mrs. Patterson's voice trailed off, and she looked sadly at Lily. She always seemed so frightened. More frightened than children should be. Mrs. Patterson, I'd like to take you back to the evening of October 15th, 18 months ago. Do you remember that night? The elderly woman's eyes grew distant as she recalled the memory. I certainly do. It was the night that changed everything for that poor child. I was letting Rusty out for his evening business when I heard crying from my backyard. What did you find when you investigated the crying? Little Lily was sitting by my rose bushes, just sobbing her heart out. Rusty went right to her. He's always been good with children, and she was talking to him like he was a person. At first, I thought it was sweet, you know, the way children confide in animals. Webb felt her pulse quicken. But then what happened? Mrs. Patterson's expression grew troubled. I got closer and started listening to what she was saying. She was telling Rusty about things that no 7-year-old should know about. Adult things. Scary things. She was describing someone touching her in ways that made me sick to my stomach. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to hold her breath as Mrs. Patterson continued. She told Rusty that the policeman came to her room when her mama was at work. She said he showed her his gun and his badge and told her that police officers can do whatever they want, and no one would believe her if she told because everyone loves policemen. Kane started to object, but Judge Stone silenced him with a look. Mrs. Patterson, Webb continued, what did you do after you heard Lily talking to your dog? I tried to approach her gently, to ask her what was wrong, but she saw me and got terrified. She ran home faster than I'd ever seen a child run. The next morning, I called the police. I told them I was worried about the little girl next door, that something terrible was happening to her. Webb turned to face the jury, making sure they understood the significance of this testimony. Mrs. Patterson, you were the anonymous tipster who first reported suspected abuse in the Martinez household. Yes, dear. I couldn't get what I'd heard out of my mind. That child was asking a dog for help because she was too scared to ask any human being. It broke my heart. The revelation hit Torres like a physical blow. His carefully constructed defense was crumbling before his eyes. The prosecution had just established that Lily's disclosure wasn't coached. It was organic, spontaneous, and made to the one creature she felt safe enough to trust with her terrible secret. Rex, still sitting faithfully beside Lily, seemed to understand the weight of Mrs. Patterson's words. His eyes moved from the elderly witness to Detective Torres, and for the first time in his career as a therapy dog, Rex's calm demeanor showed a crack of something that looked remarkably like disapproval. The shocking truth was finally emerging. Lily's courage to speak to a dog in a neighbor's backyard had set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately bring her abuser to justice. And now, with Mrs. Patterson's testimony corroborating every detail, Torres's nightmare was just beginning. The courtroom atmosphere shifted dramatically as Mrs. Patterson's testimony sank in. What had begun as a difficult he said, she said, case between a decorated police officer and a traumatized child had transformed into something far more compelling. A story of a little girl whose desperate whisper to a neighbor's dog had ultimately led to the exposure of a predator hiding behind a badge. Juror number 4, Maria Gonzalez, a mother of 2 young daughters, openly wiped tears from her eyes as she looked from Mrs. Patterson to Lily. The image of a 7-year-old child feeling so alone and frightened that she could only confide in an animal struck her with devastating force. Around the jury box, similar reactions played out across the faces of men and women who understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, the unraveling of a carefully constructed lie through the pure honesty of a child and the compassion of an elderly neighbor who refused to ignore what she had witnessed. Defense attorney Marcus King found himself in an impossible position. His entire strategy had been built on the assumption that Lily's accusations were the result of adult coaching or manipulation. Mrs. Patterson's testimony had just demolished that theory completely. The anonymous tip that started the investigation hadn't come from a vindictive ex-wife or a disgruntled colleague. It had come from a 73-year-old woman who heard a child crying in her backyard and couldn't ignore the obvious signs of abuse. Kane rose desperately for cross-examination, but his usual aggressive tactics felt inappropriate and potentially harmful in the face of Mrs. Patterson's gentle, grandmotherly demeanor. Mrs. Patterson, isn't it possible that you misunderstood what you heard that night? Children often have active imaginations, and in the darkness, young man, Mrs. Patterson interrupted with the kind of quiet authority that only comes with 7 decades of life experience. I raised 4 children and helped raise 12 grandchildren. I know the difference between a child's imagination and a child in genuine terror. That little girl was describing real trauma, not make-believe. The rebuke was delivered so matter-of-factly that several spectators in the gallery actually smiled despite the gravity of the situation. Kane realized immediately that attacking Mrs. Patterson's credibility would only make him look callous and desperate. Meanwhile, Detective Torres sat at the defense table with sweat beading on his forehead despite the courtroom's air conditioning. For 18 months, he had managed to maintain his composure by convincing himself that he could weather this storm. His reputation in the community was solid, his record unblemished, and he had genuinely believed that no one would take the word of a troubled child over that of a respected police officer. But Mrs. Patterson's testimony had changed everything. The elderly woman was beyond reproach. She had no motive to lie, no axe to grind, no reason to involve herself in a messy criminal case except for her genuine concern for a child's welfare. Her simple, straightforward account of what she had witnessed carried the ring of absolute truth. Officer Jake Reynolds, still standing near the witness stand with Rex, watched Torres carefully. Reynolds had 15 years of experience reading suspects and witnesses, and everything about Torres's body language screamed guilt. The man's carefully maintained facade was crumbling, and Reynolds could see the panic beginning to set in. Rex, with his uncanny ability to sense human emotions, had also picked up on Torres's distress. The therapy dog's attention was now divided. between providing comfort to Lily and monitoring the defendant who sat across the courtroom, emanating waves of barely controlled anxiety. As Mrs. Patterson concluded her testimony and returned to her seat in the gallery, Prosecutor Diana Webb felt the momentum of the case shift decisively in her favor. She returned to Lily, who was still gently stroking Rex's fur, but now looked more composed and confident than she had at any point during the trial. "Lily," Webb said gently, "now that Mrs. Patterson has told us about that night when you talked to Rusty, can you tell us why you felt safe talking to her dog, but not to the adults around you?" Lily's answer was simple but devastating. Because dogs don't lie, and dogs don't hurt children, and dogs don't have badges that make people believe them instead of believing kids. The words hit Torres like physical blows. Several jurors turned to look directly at him, their expressions ranging from disgust to outright hostility. For the first time since the trial began, Torres found himself unable to maintain eye contact with the jury members who would determine his fate. Webb continued her questioning with surgical precision. "Lily, after you talked to Rusty that night, did Detective Torres ever threaten you about telling anyone else?" "Yes. The next day, he showed me a picture on his phone of a place where bad kids go when they lie about police officers. He said it was called juvenile detention, and that kids there don't get to see their mommies anymore." This revelation prompted audible gasps from several spectators. The idea of a police officer using his knowledge of the juvenile justice system to terrorize a child into silence was particularly chilling to everyone present. Dr. Jennifer Coleman, observing from the gallery, took detailed notes on Torres's reactions to each piece of testimony. As a forensic psychologist, she had evaluated hundreds of accused abusers, and Torres's behavior pattern was textbook. The initial confidence, the gradual erosion of composure, and now the visible panic all fit the profile of someone whose carefully constructed lies were being systematically dismantled. Judge Patricia Stone watched the proceedings with growing certainty that she was witnessing one of the most compelling cases of her judicial career. The intersection of a child's courage, an animal's comfort, and an elderly woman's moral conviction had created a perfect storm of truth that was impossible to deny. As Lily's testimony continued, with Rex providing steady emotional support, her voice grew stronger and more confident. She described specific incidents with remarkable clarity, detailing not just what Torres had done to her, but how he had used his authority and position to ensure her silence. "He told me that police officers stick together," Lily said, her small hand never leaving Rex's head. "He said that even if I told someone, his police friends would say I was lying, and they would take me away from Mama forever." The systematic nature of Torres's psychological manipulation became clear through Lily's testimony. This wasn't just physical abuse. It was a calculated campaign of terror designed to ensure that his victim would never find the courage to speak out. But Torres had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated the healing power of a child's bond with animals and the moral courage of an elderly neighbor who refused to turn away from obvious suffering. As the afternoon wore on, and Lily's testimony concluded, the courtroom had been transformed from a place of legal procedure into a theater of human drama, where truth had finally found its voice. Rex remained at Lily's side throughout, a silent testament to the power of unconditional love and support in helping survivors find the courage to speak their truth. The defense's case, which had seemed strong just hours earlier, now lay in ruins. Torres's reputation, his freedom, and his carefully constructed life were about to be destroyed by the very child he had tried so hard to silence. The jury deliberated for exactly 97 minutes, one of the shortest deliberations in Riverside County history for a case of such magnitude. When the bailiff announced their return, the courtroom filled with an electric tension that made the very air seem to vibrate with anticipation. Detective Raymond Torres, who had spent the recess staring blankly at his hands, looked up with the hollow eyes of a man who had already accepted his fate. Lily remained in the witness area with Rex at her side, though she was no longer testifying. Judge Patricia Stone had made the unprecedented decision to allow the therapy dog to stay with the child throughout the verdict, recognizing that this case had shattered conventional protocols in service of a higher justice. Officer Jake Reynolds stood nearby, his hand resting lightly on Rex's back, both man and dog maintaining their protective vigil over the little girl who had found the courage to speak truth to power. Foreman Michael Chun, a high school principal and father of 3, stood with the gravity befitting the moment. His hands trembled slightly as he held the verdict form, not from nervousness, but from the emotional weight of what the jury had witnessed over the past 2 days. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Stone asked, her voice carrying the formality of legal procedure, but tinged with the human understanding of what was at stake. "We have, Your Honor, on the charge of aggravated sexual assault of a minor. How do you find guilty?" The single word detonated through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Carmen Martinez, Lily's mother, collapsed into her seat with a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, a sound that contained 18 months of guilt, fear, and desperate hope that justice might finally be served for her daughter. "On the charge of child endangerment, how do you find guilty?" Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, sitting in the second row, pulled out a handkerchief that looked older than some of the people in the courtroom and dabbed at her eyes. The elderly woman who had refused to ignore a child's cry for help felt a profound satisfaction in knowing that her decision to speak up had ultimately led to this moment. "On the charge of abuse of authority under color of law, how do you find guilty?" Torres's head dropped to the defense table with an audible thud. The man who had spent years hiding behind his badge, using his authority to terrorize and abuse, finally understood that his carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation had collapsed completely. Defense Attorney Kane sat in stunned silence. In 30 years of criminal defense, he had never seen a case collapse so thoroughly and so dramatically. The prosecution's evidence had been overwhelming, but more than that, the emotional truth of Lily's testimony, supported by Rex's calming presence and Mrs. Patterson's corroborating account, had created an undeniable narrative of courage triumphing over corruption. As the remaining guilty verdicts were read, a total of 7 felony counts, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of tears, applause, and relieved sobbing. Judge Stone allowed the emotional release to continue for several moments before calling for order. "Detective Torres," she said, her voice now carrying the cold authority of judicial judgment, "you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will be held in 30 days, but I want you to understand the severity of these crimes. You used your position of trust and authority to prey upon an innocent child. You terrorized her into silence using the very badge that should have represented her protection. The maximum sentence for these combined charges is 25 years in state prison, and I assure you that I will be considering the full extent of the law." Torres was led away in handcuffs, his police uniform replaced by Orange County jail attire that would be his wardrobe for decades to come. As he passed Lily's position, Rex stood up and positioned himself directly between the convicted predator and the child he had worked so hard to protect. It was a small gesture, but everyone in the courtroom understood its significance. 3 weeks later, the sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd than the trial itself. Judge Stone delivered a 23-year sentence with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. But the real victory had already been won in the days and weeks following the conviction. As Lily began the long process of healing with the help of professional counselors, her mother's unwavering support, and regular visits from a very special therapy dog named Rex, the impact of Lily's case extended far beyond one courtroom in Riverside County. Within 6 months, The state legislature passed comprehensive reforms requiring therapy animals to be available for child witnesses in all felony cases involving minors. The bill, officially known as the Lily Martinez Child Witness Protection Act, became a model for similar legislation in 37 other states. Officer Reynolds and Rex became the poster team for courthouse therapy animal programs, traveling to conferences and training sessions across the country. But they never forgot their first and most important case, returning to visit Lily every month as she continued her recovery. Dr. Jennifer Coleman published a groundbreaking paper on the case, documenting how the presence of a therapy animal had enabled a traumatized child to overcome psychological barriers that might otherwise have prevented justice from being served. Her research contributed to a growing body of evidence supporting animal-assisted therapy in legal proceedings. Mrs. Patterson, who had initially worried that she might be interfering by calling the police about her young neighbor, became a local hero and an advocate for elderly citizens reporting suspected child abuse. If you see something that doesn't look right, she would tell audiences at community meetings, "Speak up. You might be the only voice the child has." 6 months after Torres's conviction, at a ceremony honoring victims' rights advocates, Lily stood at a podium in the state capitol building. Rex sat beside her, wearing a special golden collar that designated him as an honorary member of the state police force. When reporters asked Lily what she wanted to be when she grew up, she reached down to pet Rex's head and smiled with genuine happiness for the first time in years. "I want to be a police officer," she said confidently. "One of the good ones. And I want to work with dogs who help scared kids find their voices." The little girl who had once whispered desperately to a neighbor's dog for help had become a voice for justice, healing, and hope. Her courage had not only brought her own abuser to justice, but had created a lasting legacy that would protect countless other children for generations to come. In the end, Rex had done more than provide comfort to one frightened child. He had helped transform the entire justice system's approach to protecting its most vulnerable witnesses. And Lily's whispered plea for help had become a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest voices, when given the right support, can change the world.